Hello, this is a video lecture for the respiratory system in our A&P unit. So the respiratory system is a very important system because it is what's responsible for getting oxygen into our body and getting carbon dioxide out. So oxygen is essential to the life of the cell. And if you remember from our very intro portion of A&P, the health of the cells is really, the health of the whole body is dependent on the health of the cells. So body systems, organs, tissues, cells, right down to the smallest part, everything is really intertwined in terms of health. So it's absolutely essential we get that oxygen into our cells. We also need to get the carbon dioxide out. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct of cell metabolism. We need to get that carbon dioxide out of the body because if that builds up too much too, that can definitely cause illness in the body. So we need our respiratory system. It's we need all our systems, but it's a very important one. So the respiratory system consists of lots of different things. It consists of the upper respiratory tract. So the upper, which you can see a diagram of on page 84, figure 4-16. So the upper respiratory tract is basically everything before we get to like the epiglottis in the throat, okay? So we're talking like our nasal passages, all the sinuses, the mouth as well, because, I should say some animals can breathe through their mouths. Some animals are obligate nasal breathers, like rabbits, and they need to breathe through their nose. They can't breathe through their mouth. So in that case, their upper respiratory tract wouldn't include their mouth. And then includes the pharynx, which is the throat area. So I don't get into super detail. I'm not going to draw a diagram of that or anything for the upper nasal or respiratory system and the nasal passages. But one thing I want to mention in the nasal passages, they contain turbinates. So the turbinates are these little scroll bones, okay? So they look like little scrolls, and by scrolls I mean like this, inside the nasal passages. You could Google a picture now if you'd like to see a picture. I do have skulls in the classroom, so when we are back on campus, I can certainly show you in a real skull what those turbinates look like. But those guys are responsible for warming up air and moisturizing it. So these scrolly bones, they're all scrolled together like that to give lots of surface area, and then they're covered in mucous membrane. So those mucous membranes produce mucus, and that mucus helps to moisturize the air we're breathing in. It also helps to warm it up. So there's lots of like blood vessels really near to the surface there to warm up the air that's going into the lungs. I'm sure you've all experienced in these harsh Winnipeg winters that it really bloody hurts to have to breathe such cold air. So those turbinates help to warm up the air and get it nice and moist before it's coming into our lungs. So that's something I wanted to mention about the upper respiratory tract. So moving down into the lower respiratory tract, we start with the epiglottis. Well, actually, maybe I'm going to talk about that with the diagram. So I want to talk about how breathing actually happens. So the chest cavity has a diaphragm. So if I drew a little picture of the body, right, there's the arms. I'm drawing a human, but you get the point. This could be a dog too laying on its back. So we have a diaphragm. Dogs have a diaphragm that goes across the body. It divides the thorax from the abdomen. Okay, so that diaphragm, when an animal breathes in, it pulls down, and that expands the space in here, okay, in the chest. The lungs, all this needs to be negative pressure, so that when that diaphragm pulls down, it acts like a vacuum and it sucks air into the thorax, okay? So we need to have negative pressure in the chest area, in the lungs, for the animal to breathe properly, okay? So when the diaphragm contracts, it pulls down, and that sucks air into the lungs. So once that air is in the lungs, we're going to see gas exchange happening in the alveoli, which is the smallest portion. I'll get to that in the diagram. And then maybe I'll just flip over to the diagram. I feel like that's going to make the most sense. So I pre-drew this time, so you don't have to just sit watching me draw like when we did the cardiovascular one. So I pre-drew the picture and I figured I'd label it as we go. So right up here, very first thing is the epiglottis. The epiglottis covers the entrance to the trachea. The trachea is the windpipe, okay? This is where air needs to go. Epiglottis covers it because we don't want anything else in there. We don't want food or water or vomit or anything else in our trachea because that can give us aspiration pneumonia. So we do not want to aspirate anything or get something into the lungs that shouldn't be in there. We just want those things going into like the esophagus most likely. So the esophagus and the trachea are like basically two stacked tubes in the pharynx or the throat. So we want the trachea, or the epiglottis, or the esophagus. So the epiglottis covers up the trachea if we're swallowing into the epiglottis. Oh my goodness, if we're swallowing into the esophagus. And it's open when we're breathing into the trachea, okay? So epiglottis up here, open because air is going into the trachea now. You'll see that the trachea has these guys here, which are C-shaped rings. Has C-shaped cartilage rings. Those C-shaped cartilage rings give the trachea, like, it holds it open. It gives it structure. So you'll see sometimes in animals that they have flattened C-shaped rings, so lots of small dogs have that, and then they have a collapsing trachea where they can't breathe properly. So obviously that's not a good thing. So trachea has these big C-shaped rings. The trachea also has something called cilia, so I'm just going to write about the cilia up here. Cilia. So the cilia are like small hair-like projections. And these guys propel mucus and debris up to be coughed out. Okay, so that's the cilia. So the cilia are responsible, they have all these little hairs and they sweep upwards. They're responsible for getting debris or mucus out of the airways, those lower airways. Okay, so after air has traveled into the trachea, it's going to travel next into the main stem bronchus. So the main stem bronchus, this is singular. If we're talking about both, it's the main stem bronchi. And then it goes into just the bronchi. And then this guy is the bronchiole. Bronchiole I always think of as meaning like tiny and cute. And then lastly, it ends in the alveolar sac. Oh, whoops, alveolar sac, which contains alveoli. So the alveoli are the site of gas exchange, okay? So I'm gonna write here site of O2CO2 exchange. Oh, it got tight there, sorry. So basically air comes in, goes right down here. The alveoli are what interact with the capillaries to exchange that gas, okay? So if you think of it kind of like a tree, right? This is the respiratory tree. It's just an upside down one. We've got that big main trunk, or the trachea. Then we have our main branches, right? Our main stem bronchus. Then we have smaller branches, or just a branch, right? Bronchi. Then we have our bronchioles, which are cute, tiny little branches. And then we have our alveoli, which are like the leaves. Okay, so hopefully that analogy helps you kind of to remember the order here. So this basically makes up the lung. You'll also see that I've got this other like line all the way around the lungs. You might be wondering, what is that? So that is the pleura. and it completely surrounds the lungs. The pleura is what needs to maintain that negative pressure, okay? So the pleural space, which is here, has to remain empty, otherwise we're not going to have negative pressure in the lung area. So sometimes we'll see this area fill up with fluid, so it'll be called pleural effusion. So that means there's fluid in this space. Then that means that that's taking up some of the negative pressure space. So when the diaphragm contracts, the lungs aren't able to fill with air as effectively. If an animal has maybe you've heard of the term a punctured lung. If this pleura is punctured, we're going to have free air getting in to that space. And then we have no negative pressure at all. So an animal's going to have a really hard time breathing then. So that's called a pneumothorax when that happens. There's air in the chest. We can remove the air, thank goodness, with like a needle and remove some of it. And that can help the animal to get some of that pressure off and then restore some of the negative pressure so that they are able to breathe again. Let's see. Yeah, so basically if this pleural space fills up with fluid, blood, pus, air, etc., the lungs aren't going to be able to inflate properly. Okay? So respiratory system's fairly short. That's all I have for you besides the term sheet. So let's go over the term sheet. So, sorry again, mine is rather messy here. It's just an old sheet. I haven't bothered printing new ones for myself. So again, please refer to your notes for a little bit neater of a version, but I'll still go over the terms with you. So apnea means not breathing. So pnea is our, I think it's a suffix. I can't remember, suffix or root, but it means breathing. And starting with an A means lack of or not. So an apnea is not breathing. Dyspnea, D-Y-S, is painful or difficult. So a dyspneic patient is having a difficulty breathing, or it's painful for them to breathe. So they're usually doing something called posturing. Posturing means that the animal is stretching out their neck, and maybe I'm gonna flip the camera quick just to show me. Can I do that? Maybe I can't do that. Okay, well, my bad. I was gonna flip the camera and just demonstrate posturing for you, but I guess I can't really do that. But basically it's like kind of stretching out the neck. Maybe remind me and I'll show you in the virtual classroom. Okay, so asphyxiation is the fancy word for suffocation. So it's an interruption of the air supply. So animals can asphyxiate because maybe they have something lodged in their trachea, so air's not getting in, or they could be asphyxiated because like their nose is covered or their mouth is covered and they're not able to get air into the body. Anoxia means no oxygen in the body, right? So oxia is referring to oxygen, and meaning without. Cyanosis. So cyanosis, osis is an abnormal condition. Cyan is the word for blue. So cyanosis means blue colored tissues. I can describe a patient. So cyanosis is a noun. I can use the adjective of cyanotic to describe a patient. So if a patient is cyanotic, I'm describing them as having blue colored tissues. Bronchitis. Itis, inflammation of. Bronchi is referring to the bronchi. So it's inflammation of the bronchi. Congestion, that's an abnormal accumulation of fluid. If you've ever had a cold, you're familiar with congestion. So the sinuses have mucus and fluid in them. Sometimes your lungs are congested. So congestion is abnormal accumulation of fluid. Epistaxis is the fancy medical word for a nosebleed. Pulmonary edema, we talked about that in the cardiovascular system, but it's accumulation of fluid in the lung tissue. So when we're talking about pulmonary edema, we're talking fluid like in the lungs itself, okay? Pus, so here we finally have a definition of pus. So it's a fluid product of inflammation composed of white blood cells, exudate, which is just like debris and stuff that's been secreted, and cellular debris. Okay, so what is the correct terminology for pus? We don't say something is pussy. Pussy? No, we say purulent. Okay. Tachypnea. Tachypnea is fast breathing. We don't have on here, but we should. I'm not sure. I can't remember if you have it in your sheets, but hyperpnea is, so tachypnea is more like panting. And then hyperpnea is when you are breathing harder and faster. So like after exercise, you probably have a hyperpnea. So you're breathing deeper and faster after like some kind of physical exertion. Whereas tachypnea is more of like just like a panting or really fast, like hyperventilating breathing. So pleural is referring to the pleura, which is that membrane around the lungs. I can't believe they don't have it in here, but pleural effusion then would be this pleural space having fluids in it. So pneumonia. We've talked about pneumonia already, as we talked about as inflammation of the lungs. Here we expand that definition a little bit more. It's inflammation of the lungs with consolidation. And consolidation means that the lung tissue is filled with fluid. So when there's actual fluid in the lung space, that is pneumonia. So consolidation is just a finding on X-ray, meaning that the lungs have fluid in it. So pneumothorax, pneum means air, thorax is chest. So the direct definition is air in the chest. And I'm sure you're like, isn't that what the lungs are for? Well, yes and no. When we're talking about a pneumothorax, that's when we're saying that there's air in this pleural space, okay? So it's not that there's air in the alveoli, which is what we want. It's that air is in this space where we don't want. Hemothorax is when there's blood in that space. Pyothorax, when there's pus in that space. So then we have hypoxia. So anoxia is no oxygen, hypoxia is deficient oxygen. Nasogastric. So we can just use our word parts to figure this out. Nase is nose, gastra is stomach, ic is pertaining to. So nasogastric is pertaining to the nose and stomach. We will sometimes place nasogastric tubes to feed pets that aren't eating. So it goes into the nose. The nose articulates in that pharynx area. Instead of going into the trachea, which is where air would go, we just put the tube into the esophagus to get down to the stomach. So the larynx is the voice box, or the bark box, or the meow box, I like to call it. We talked about the turbinates and the nasal passages to warm and moisturize air. And then I have another one that was missing from here is aspiration. So aspiration is inhaling of a foreign substance. So that could be like vomit, it could be food, it could be a liquid, anything like that. Okay, so that's all I have to share with you about the respiratory system. So a little bit shorter than some of our other videos. You can read about the respiratory system on pages 84 to 86 in your Elsevier textbook. There's also chapter 10 in your McBride textbook. And I do have a respiratory review practice activity for you as well, so you can kind of engage with the material there. If you do have any questions, again, please make sure you do ask me in either the virtual classroom, in the chat, or send me an email. I would like to help you understand everything as much as I can. So that's everything I have for you now. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.